This video is Shop Apprentice approved. I'm Mike Farrington, welcome back to the boardroom, and thanks for joining me. In this video, I'm going to be building a desk that's designed for two people to work at the same time. So I used my incredibly creative brain to title this one, A Desk Built for Two. So after assembling the left and right cabinets that are drawer banks, I turned my attention to adding some shelf pinholes to the center cabinet. So I break out my trusty dusty router jig to help me knock these shelf pinholes out in rapid fire. Next I move on to making some drawer boxes. I'm building them from 1/2-inch thick Baltic birch plywood, and it's pre-finished with some sort of UV cured lacquer. And if you ever needed proof that plywood isn't flat, just look at the material I'm using here. This stuff closely resembles a potato chip. Here I'm adding a 1/4 inch groove 1/2 inch up from the bottom. This will house the bottoms of the drawer boxes. This little shim allows the biscuit slot to be centered on 1/2-inch material. And that's right, you guessed it, I'm going to use the mighty biscuit to join these drawer boxes together. And for 1/2-inch thick material, I like to use size 0 biscuits. And even though size 0 biscuits are one of the smaller sizes, they're incredibly strong in spirit. And using size 0 biscuits creates a very strong drawer box that goes together really quickly. During this build, I heard the song I Want to Get Better by The Bleachers, and this is an interesting song to me because it has an overall happy feel to it, but if you listen to the lyrics, they're fairly dark, and I think the tension between the lyrics and the mood really make for an interesting song. So, if you'd like, give it a listen. In all of the excitement of gluing the drawer boxes together, I totally forgot to notch the back of the drawers to accept the undermount slides I plan to use. So a router with a flush trim bit seemed like the easiest way to remedy the issue. Now at this point I'm ready to install some hardware. For this project I'm going to be using a drawer slide called the Blum Tandem, and that's an undermount drawer slide with a soft close feature. And these drawer slides aren't cheap, but I really like them because of the soft close feature and also because they have a lot of adjustability. And this jig that I'm using helps with accurately installing the locking mechanisms that go on the bottom of the front of the drawer, as well as drilling these registration holes in the back of the drawer. Next, I drill the 5mm holes in the cabinet sides to accept the drawer slides themselves. And in classic Farrington form, I drill the middle hole in the wrong place. So during installation, I just decided to use 2 screws, and that'll be plenty strong enough. And here's where these slides really help pay for themselves. They come on and off with just a quick click, and this is great for both delivery and painting. And these little wheels allow the drawer box to be moved left and right, which is really nice when you're trying to line up all of the drawer fronts. And the drawer box itself can be raised and lowered relative to the drawer slide, and here I'm showing how that works on the back of the drawer slide. And next I move on to making some doors and drawer fronts. In between the bandsaw and the chop saw, I rough out all my parts. And when roughing out parts, I leave them somewhere between a 1/2 inch and 1 inch long and about 3/16 of an inch wide. So with everything cut to rough size, I move on to final milling. And having to mill each individual part to final dimension is a little more work versus just milling down large boards and cutting the pieces out from it. But I think that the parts turn out more accurate in the end this way. So after milling is complete, it's time to sand the inside edges of all the parts. And for that I use my trusty Edge Tech sanding disc. So this is just a disc that's slightly cone shaped, or I guess you could call it tapered, and it has a 2-degree taper to it. And when set up properly, it leaves a perfectly sanded, perfectly 90-degree edge on your workpiece. And the reason it's slightly tapered is for entry and exit. That's what I'm showing here. As you can see, that taper allows a slightly wider entry and a slightly wider exit. Yet right in the middle where it's doing the sanding, it's touching the wood at 90 degrees. And if you're looking at this wondering why you need a disc sander on your table saw, this is in no way a disc sander in the traditional sense. This is a tool designed specifically for sanding the edges of parts. And I'll have a link in the description below with more information. Next, I move on to some simple joinery to hold the 5 pieces of the door and drawer fronts together. And all I'm doing is running a 1/4 inch groove, 1/2 inch deep, all the way around the inside edges of the doors and on the ends of the rails. And I do this by setting up my router table, then I add a 3/8 inch shim onto the router fence. I make all the cuts, then I remove that shim and I make all the cuts again for a full depth pass. And glue up is super simple. I add some glue into the grooves that house the center panel. This locks the center panel in place and adds a great deal of strength to the door or drawer front. And for the finishing touch, I add, I guess what you'd call a floating tenon, or maybe it would be better called a spline. Once the glue is dry, I send everything through the wide belt sander, 1 pass on each side with a 120 grit, and I'm ready to move on. After the doors have been sanded flat, I drill the necessary holes for the hinges. I like to glue a shim in place on the back of the drawer fronts to prevent the center panel from bowing when I add the drawer pulls. Next, I drill 2 5mm holes for the hinge plates. And these spacers that I'm using drill these 2 holes for the hinge plates in such a way that the bottom of the door lines up with the bottom of the cabinet. Next, I used a few biscuits to help align what I call a finished end. And in this case, the biscuits are just used for alignment. And a finished end is just any material, in this case I'm using MDF, that's used to cover the outside faces of cabinets. And a finished end is nice to use because it covers up all the screws holding the cabinet together, but it also allows me to paint a flat surface versus having to mask and spray the side of an entire cabinet. And here I'm just installing some nailers. These are used to screw through and then attach the cabinet to the wall. Here's a pro tip. Anytime I find myself with a nailer that's visible inside of a cabinet, I just cut out a little cover plate and I install these after I screw the cabinet to the wall with some caulking. Normally when I install drawer fronts, I use what are called drawer front adjusters. But in this case, I didn't have enough room in each of the styles to drill the required holes. So I just did it old school and clamped the drawer front to the drawer box and screwed it in place. For the upper drawers, I wasn't able to clamp the drawer front directly to the drawer, so I used some 1/8 inch spacers, clamped the drawer front to the cabinet, and I pressed the drawer against the back of the drawer front. Here I'm just putting together, I guess what you'd call like a pre-made baseboard, and I keep this separate from the toe kick, and I do this so that I can shim the toe kick level, and then this baseboard can still set on the ground to cover up any gap created when shimming. This way, any gap will be between the top of this baseboard and the cabinet where no one will really see it. So, it was at this point in the project I got a call from the customer and they wanted to add something. They wanted me to build a matching cork board to be mounted above the desk. So, it was back to milling some more lumber. And I was fortunate to have enough lumber laying around to where I didn't need to make another run to the material store. So I built a very simple frame with a rabbet in the back that will house the corkboard. So for this I ended up just ordering a corkboard on Amazon, and I took the frame that came with it off and I put that corkboard in the frame that I made. This ended up being much cheaper than having to buy a whole roll of the corkboard material. We'll say it feels like cheating every time I use the Festool Domino, but it speeds up small projects like this so much I almost consider it a must-have for the small cabinet shop or furniture maker. Next I add a real small round over to the outside edges of all the doors and drawer fronts. And this bit has a 3/32 inch radius. Lastly, some quick sanding before it's off for paint. And in my opinion, there is no substitute for hand sanding. Cleaning up roundovers, easing edges, fixing small imperfections. These are the little details that help separate a good project from a great project. Alright, at this point, the project is pretty much completed. The last thing to build is the countertop. These are called countertop bolts, and really what they're good for is clamping pieces together that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get clamps on. And I just measured and marked these cutouts, and then I freehand cut with the router. So I used a few biscuits for alignment, I used some glue of course, and I used the countertop bolts to clamp everything together. And though they're called countertop bolts, these work for a million different operations as long as you can hide the mortise that they sit in. And finally, I glue and screw a piece of plywood over the joint for some added reinforcement. So here's the completed structure, spanning 12 feet. Next step is to add a lipping on the front. And here's a perfect example of you can never have too many clamps. Once the glue is dry, I grabbed my lipping planer and I leveled the front edging to the plywood. Once those two surfaces were leveled, it was time to grab the piece of laminate that I ordered. This piece happens to be 12 feet long and 5 feet wide. And I really like this design. In fact, I'm going to use the offcut on a desk that I'm going to make for my own office. And when dealing with materials this big, I think it's best to just lay them on the ground and break them down into more manageable pieces. This roller is designed specifically for use with contact adhesive. And if you've ever used a roller to spread contact adhesive, you know it can be a real sticky mess. These rollers help reduce the mess a little, but more importantly, they help spread the contact adhesive evenly and quickly. And after letting the glue tack up for a few minutes, I like to use these aluminum clamps as spacers. And these spacers allow me to get the two parts close together without accidentally touching. And I like to bump the laminate up against the head of the clamp. This kind of helps with a general alignment. And once I'm happy with the alignment, it's nice and easy to take out one clamp at a time and stick the laminate down. And I squish the two pieces together with this J roller. And I use a router with a flush trim bit to trim off all the excess. In the final detail, I put a small chamfer on the front edge. And this does two things. It makes the desk more comfortable to sit at, but during paint I mask off the laminate and I spray the front edging, and I come back with a file and I just kiss the front edge of the laminate with a file to create a nice sharp paint line. And now it's time for prime and paint. I normally don't strain primer, but in this case the can was really old and crusty. So the first step to understanding spray finishing and getting a good result is getting your material to the right viscosity. So in this shot I'm trying to show what the material looks like when it's thinned to where I like it. It drips off the stir stick and it creates ripples in the surface. And this is going to be different for different equipment setups, so every time you spray you're going to need to do some test pieces to make sure that it's spraying the way that you like. Also, just as a quick side note, shellac is flammable because it's thinned with denatured alcohol. So if you're not comfortable spraying a potentially hazardous material, I suggest using a water-based primer. Some of the water-based primers are really good. The only difference is they dry a little slower and they raise the grain more. So here I'm just showing the fan pattern that I prefer. I like a little narrower, and this is better for kind of doing the edges of the doors, inside corners, and a wider pattern can sometimes just get material everywhere. Everything gets 2 coats of primer. I start with the backs, I spray both coats, I let that dry, and I flip it over and I do the fronts. And I also spray the edges again when I do the fronts, so the edges get 4 total coats. In my opinion, spray finishing really has a kind of a vertical learning curve. And you start off not being able to do it, and it seems really challenging. And after a little practice, you have some breakthroughs, and all of a sudden it's very easy. And if you have an HVLP setup and you're struggling to spray water-based materials, there's a good reason for that. Most HVLP setups, including the higher-end turbine-driven units, lack the power to properly atomize thicker water-based coatings out of the can. So try thinning your paint a little until it sprays good. Do test pieces. I do a test piece for every single project. Just note that when you thin paint, it can run a little easier when you're spraying on vertical surfaces. It can also change the color slightly, and it will alter the drying time as well as the sheen. So this is why it's very important to do test pieces. Speaking of thick water-based coatings, this stuff is so thick it kind of piles on itself. It won't drip, and it certainly doesn't create any ripples in the surface. So normally I don't thin water-based paints because I have a conventional gun set up specifically to spray thicker coatings. But based on some advice I received from a painter friend, he said you can thin cabinet coat from Benjamin Moore, which is the paint that I'm using here. He said if you thin it down, you can spray thinner coats that then dry faster. And drying time is really the one downside to using water-based coatings. They just take a long time to dry. And overall, I really liked this new process. I think I'll use it on a few more projects in the future. I was able to spray really thin coats that dried fast. So here I'm spraying a few test pieces, and I like to spray test pieces on primed and unprimed surfaces. Unprimed surfaces, I can see how the paint is coming out of the gun a little easier. And you can see in this shot just a little texture, and that flowed out perfectly as the paint dried. So after getting the paint and the settings on my gun both dialed in, I sprayed 3 coats, and the finished product looked really beautiful. Perfectly smooth surface, and it felt real durable too. In my test pieces, I could scrape it with my thumbnail, and it resisted scraping pretty good. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. So here are a few finished shots after installation. And due to time constraints, I was unable to get any footage of me actually doing the installation. Overall, I really like this project. I think it turned out pretty cool. 2 people can work at the desk comfortably. There's space for 2 computers. There's space for a printer in the center cabinet. Some files can go in these drawers. I think the laminate looks great. And overall, I think we did about as good as we could with the space that we had. And most importantly, the customers really liked the end result. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really appreciate you following along. Thanks for watching. Till next time.